What are some of the advantages of doing wild yeast fermentations, and do our fermentations ever get stuck?
I'll make one comment and then go to John.
Sure.
Because, only because basically when I joined Ridge in, '69, the partners I joined, even though they were all PhDs and research scientists, were using traditional methods and using natural yeast. I had also used the natural yeast as had been done for since before the Greeks. I mean, wine makes itself with some guidance from man, became my sort of mantra. And it's certainly historically been true. And an interesting thing about that last part of you ever have stuck fermentations is that in the vintages in California, and I can go back to 78, 84, a number of others, where a lot of people in many varietals had stuck fermentations, lack of nutrients, whatever, the natural yeast fermentations did not stick. So we have had at Ridge virtually no stuck fermentations because of the use of natural yeast. And because they are more acclimatized, they come in from that vineyard on the grapes, and we found out now from the Europeans and our own research that they're brought to the grapes as they mature and on any broken grape by bees, wasps, on and on, insects that bring the yeast that's overwintered with them. They bring it as they come to any broken berry that has sweet juice that they're attracted to. And that natural yeast is part of that vineyard, and not that there isn't shared with other vineyards, but it really is acclimatized. So for us, it has always worked. We always have some commercial yeast on hand, and yet the natural yeast have worked. And John, I mean, typically for you, how's it going?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because certainly before I really came to winemaking, when I opened up every book I've ever seen, it says that if you don't use commercial yeast, you'll have a stuck fermentation. And I confess, when I came to Ridge, I was a little hesitant, and I've never seen a stuck fermentation.
So it seems like there's this real misunderstanding within the industry.
I think so. Yeah. I do. I really think so.
Well, I think it's people. You've got to realize that David has his master's and his BS at Davis, but that's in viticulture. John was trained in France, did stages with Chave, did stages at Tempier, stage with Aubert de Villaine, and comes out of this traditional world. And of course, I couldn't have gotten through Davis if I had tried. And so, as someone who had to switch to philosophy, because I was so bad at science, the way that wine had been made traditionally, and the finest California wines I ever had were from the 30s that had been made traditionally. The old Inglenooks and La Cuesta down on the peninsula, and those were great wines and more complex than the modern high technology wines. But what is taught at Davis, what is taught at Fresno, you must use, and even in France, you must use commercial yeast if you're going to have a complete fermentation, and it's simply not true.
And part of it is the fermentation dynamics. I mean, it's kind of one of those things, human nature, right? It's too much of a good thing. So if you add a little bit of yeast, that's great. So you just keep adding more. So the amount of yeast that they say to pitch a fermentation, to start a fermentation, is way more than you actually need. And that creates this crazy dynamic, because those yeasts go immediately after the sugar and they eat up all their nutrients. And that's when you can have issues with the fermentation, where they basically, kind of what we're doing in the planet right now as humans, out racing our resources. That's what yeast will do if you add too many to a fermentation. Where if it's an indigenous yeast fermentation, they start out with, I don't know how many different
2% or some very small.
Yeah, no, it's tiny amount, but there are lots of other things in there eating on that sugar. Right. But after maybe 1% alcohol, the only thing that's alive is Cerevisiae, and that starts at a low population and then builds nicely. So the dynamics of the fermentation.
Now
are
you
better.
have to be sensitive because of that low population. You have to, in your fermentations, red wine fermentations, you have to aerate. That is, you have to draw the wine off into a tub where the juice will become aerated to keep that multiplication going with the yeast. Because with that small population, you may not, if you don't do that, you won't have enough to finish. And perhaps that's the problem, is that people don't realize that when you use the natural yeast, you have to be more attentive to how the fermentation is going, and you have to know that it must be pumped over and aerated right on through, or it could stick.
Right. That's the experience. Okay. Well, it's our alma mater's fault. Is that's what we determined, David? Is that what it is?
That's
yeah.
it.